Hi, welcome to Makeup and Monarchies. My name is Tiffany. I am a cosmetologist, makeup artist, lover of all things UK medieval history. Today we're going to be talking about Richard II. Was he as bad as they say he was? I don't know. It's probably still up for debate, but that being said, let's get into it. Hello. So Richard was born on January 6th of 1367 at the Archbishop's Palace of Bordeaux. He was the youngest son of Edward the Black Prince and Joan of Kent. The Black Prince was the heir to his father, Edward III, Daddy Edward. His mother was previously married, Joan of Kent, was previously married and had 4 surviving children from that marriage. So those were the Holland children. So Thomas, John, Joan, and Maud. John's gonna sound familiar because he had a thing with somebody else later down the line, or it was Thomas, I don't remember. This gets very confusing after a while. According to contemporary sources, 3 kings were present at his birth: the King of Castile, the King of Navarre, and the King of Portugal. When Richard was 3, his older brother Edward died at 6 years old. In the same year, his father contracted dysentery in Spain while he was on a military campaign. Edward, the Black Prince, never fully recovered from this and died from the long-standing illness in 1376. Upon his death, this left Richard as the heir to the English throne. The House of Commons, which was the lower house of Parliament, were fearful that John of Gaunt, Richard's uncle, would usurp the throne. And so Richard was invested as the Prince of Wales and all of his father's titles quickly. Not even a year after his father's death, his grandfather, Daddy Edward, died on June 21st. He had been sick for some years prior to his death. And so Richard succeeded his grandfather on the throne of England at only 10 years old. His coronation was held on July 6th at Westminster Abbey. The day before, he went through on horseback from the Tower of London to the Abbey. The streets were busy with entertainers and decorated in bright banners and tapestries. This was the first ever coronation procession. At the ceremony itself, there were notable names that were present: John Holland, who was his half-brother, and Thomas Holland, his nephew. His cousins, Edward of Norwich, son of Edmund of Langley, and John Beaufort, son of John of Gaunt. Others that were there were John Montacute, Lord Thomas Le Despencer, and Earl and Hugh, Earl of Strafford. Following the coronation, fears of John of Gaunt's possible ambitions influenced political decision, and the regency being led by Richard's uncles was avoided. The king was instead allowed to exercise his kingship with the assistance of series of continual councils. Uncle John and Uncle Thomas of Woodstock still had some influence over the business of government, but Richard's friends, counselors, gained more control over royal affair. 2 friends were at the center of this: Sir Simon de Burghley and Robert de Vere, 9th Earl of Oxford. Within 3 years, these counselors lost the trust of the Commons, and the counselors were done away with in 1380. Through adding to the anger and mistrust was a taxation that was a heavy burden and was collected through 3 poll taxes between 77 and 80. This money was spent on unsuccessful military expeditions on the mainland of Europe. The following year, there was resentment towards or against the governing classes in the lower levels of English society. The Peasants' Revolt broke out in 1381 and was sparked by the poll tax. However, at the root of the problem was the tensions between peasants and landowners that was caused by financial and demographic outcome of the Black Death and outbreaks of the plague. It started in Kent and Essex in late May. On June 21st a band of peasants gathered at Blackheath near London. This was under the leaders Wat Tyler, John Ball, and Jack Straw. John of Gaunt's estate, Savoy Palace, was burned down, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, and Lord High Treasurer Robert Hales were both killed. Richard was sheltered at the Tower of London with his counselors. He agreed that the crown didn't have the forces to dispense the rebels, and the only option at that point was to negotiate. It's not really clear how Richard was involved with the negotiations at this point. He set out on the River Thames on June 13th, but because of the enormous amount of people on the banks at Greenwich, it was impossible for him to land. This forced him back to the Tower, and the next day he set out on horseback and met with the rebels at Mile End. Richard agreed to the rebels' demands, but this only furthered their cause more, and they continued with the looting and the killing. Richard met with Wat Tyler again the following day at Smithfield. I know this looks nuts right now, but there's reasons for it. And repeated the demands that could be met. Typical man. Not listening to what you say the first time. Wat wasn't convinced of Richard's sincerity, and so Richard's men were on edge and a fight broke out. Not shocking. William Walworth, the mayor of London, was pulled down from his horse, and the rebels killed him. Obviously, the situation got even more tense once the rebels figured out what happened. Richard remained calm and said, supposedly, "I am your captain, follow me," led the mob away from the scene. Now, as a mom of an almost 14-year-old, I am impressed that a teenager would remain calm. Especially a teenage boy. Walworth gathered a force to surround the peasant army, but the king granted clemency and allowed them to go home. Richard ended up revoking the pardons that he granted, and rebellions soon picked up again. He went to Essex personally to suppress the rebellion there. On June 28th, he defeated the last of the rebels and basically ended the peasants' revolt. The following days were spent hunting down rebel leaders and killing them. Even though Richard was in his teens, he showed courage, strength, and determination handling the rebellions. After the peasants' revolt, Richard starts to be seen in the annals. And if you don't know what the annals are, they are basically a history chronological timeline. On January 20th of 1382, Richard married Anne of Bohemia. She was the daughter of Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor. They were married at Westminster Abbey, and Anne's coronation took place 2 days after. This marriage had some diplomatic significance to it. Bohemia and the Holy Roman Emperor were seen as possible allies to France. Now remember, we are still in the middle of the 100 Years' War at this point. That was England and France at war. It wasn't a popular marriage in England. Anne came with no dowry, and Richard actually paid for the marriage. The marriage itself was good. The two really seemed to love each other. They were rarely apart and were devoted to each other, but they never had children. Michael de la Pole had a huge part in the marriage negotiations for the king and was made chancellor in 1383 and then Earl of Suffolk in 1385. Another member of Richard's close circle was Robert de Vere, Earl of Oxford. He became a favorite of Richard's, and the close friendship became disliked. This hatred, if you will, intensified when he was made Duke of Ireland in 1386. It's suggested that this was a homosexual relationship because of the resentment Thomas Walsingham had toward the king. But who knows, really? I mean, they could have just been bros. I mean, who knows? The issues of the war with France came to a head when the court party wanted to negotiate, but John of Gaunt, so that Uncle John and Thomas of Woodstock, Uncle Thomas, urged a huge campaign to protect English possessions. So a crusade was led by Henry de, this guy's name always fucks me up, Hugh Le Despencer. Richard then turned his attention to Scotland and led an expedition north. Nothing really came of this. Fucking let this country be, Jesus Christ. Richard and his Uncle John's relationship was falling apart, and the rumors of him wanting the throne was spreading. John left England to lay claim to the Castilian throne in 1386. The unofficial leadership passed to Uncle Thomas, who was created Duke of Gloucester, and Richard Fitzalan, 4th Earl of Arundel. Threat of an English invasion grew stronger in 1386. Michael de la Pole requested attacks on this is my least favorite word. I'm fucking tired of hearing it. However, on an unprecedented level for the defense of the country. Parliament said abso-fucking-lutely not, and wouldn't consider anything until de la Pole was removed. It's thought that Parliament was working with Uncle Thomas and Richard Fitzalan. Richard famously said he would not dismiss them. King Richard famously said he would not dismiss as much as a scullion from his kitchen at Parliament's request. He was then threatened with deposition and was forced to let Michael go. Richard was left very unsettled by this insult to his royal authority. He went on a tour of the country in November of 87 to try and gather more support for his cause. He made Robert de Vere Justice of Chester and started working on a loyal military base in Cheshire. When he returned to London, Richard was confronted by his Uncle Thomas and Richard Fitzalan and Thomas de Beauchamp. They wanted an appeal of treason against the men who were loyal to him. Richard stalled the negotiations to buy himself some time because he was waiting on Robert de Vere to get there with military reinforcements. I'm gonna pop off real quick and do my liner. I'll be back. Uncle Thomas, or Uncle Tommy, Fitzalan and Beauchamp joined forces with Uncle John's son, Henry Bolingbroke, and Thomas de Mowbray. That last name fucks me up every time too. This group became known as the Lords Appellant. We have talked about that before, and I forget whose video that was in, but we have talked about this before. On December 20th of 1387, the group cut Robert de Vere off at Redcoat Bridge, and he was pressed to leave the country. Richard was left with no choice but to agree to the appellant's demands. 2 of the men in the king's inner circle were condemned and executed. The merciless Parliament found de Vere and de la Pole guilty and were sentenced to death, but they had already left the country. Robert ended up dying in 92 during a boar hunt. Michael de la Pole died a year later in France, not by execution. Richard reestablished royal authority. In the following months of the deliberations, maybe that is better, of the merciless Parliament. The Lords Appellant aggressive foreign policy failed when they tried to build an anti-French coalition, which came to nothing. Northern England became victim to a Scottish incursion. Richard was now over 21 years old and could claim the right to govern on his own. Uncle John came back to England in 1389 and settled his differences with his nephew. Richard gained full control over government on May 3rd of 89. He outlined a foreign policy that revered the actions of the appealants by looking for peace and reconciliation with France. He promised to lessen the burden of taxation on the people. The next 8 years saw a peaceful ruling from Richard. Everyone played nice and made up, or did that. Since the national security was secured, Richard started negotiating for a permanent peace with France. A proposal was put forward in 1389, 1393. Get your shit straight. That would have expanded the territory of Aquitaine that was owned by England. I looked like a fucking cartoon there for a second. But the plan failed because it had a requirement that Richard would pay homage to the King of France. This was a condition that was found unacceptable to the English public. On June 7th of 1394, Anne of Bohemia died of the plague at Sheen Palace. Her death left Richard devastated, so much so that he had Sheen Palace demolished. Meanwhile, in Ireland, the English lordships were in danger of being overrun by the Gaelic Irish kingdoms. The Anglo-Irish lords were begging for Richard to, I'm not baking this in, I'm just putting it on. The Anglo-Irish lords were begging for Richard to intervene. In the autumn of 1394, Richard left for Ireland and he stayed there until May of 95. He had an army of more than 8,000 men, and it was the largest force brought there in the Middle Ages. This venture was a success, and a number of Irish chieftains submitted to English overlordship. This was one of the most successful achievements of Richard's reign. It strengthened his support at home. In 96, a truce with France was agreed, and it was supposed to last 28 years. Part of this truce was Richard agreeing to marry Isabel of Valois, daughter of Charles VI. There are some issues with the betrothal, though. Isabella was only 6 years old. Gross. And wouldn't be able to provide an heir for a long time. Richard traveled to Paris to get his new bride. They then went to Calais, where the wedding ceremony took place on October 31st of 96. It was a Halloween wedding. The following July, Richard had his uncle Tom, Richard Fitzallen, and Thomas de Beauchamp arrested. It's not really clear why this happened, but the most probable cause would be because he was retaliating against these 3 men for their role in the events that happened 10 years prior. Beauchamp was sentenced to death, but was spared and was sentenced to imprisonment. Fitzallen's brother Thomas, who was Archbishop of Canterbury, was exiled for life. Richard went after local men that were loyal to the appealants. They were fined, and this gave the crown a lot of income. This was done to support the large group of magnates, and through the conclusion of Uncle John, many of the men in the group of magnates were rewarded with new titles. Some of these men were Henry Bolingbroke, who was made Duke of Hereford, Thomas de Mowbray, made Duke of Norfolk, John Holland, Richard's older brother, half-brother, was made Duke of Exeter. Sorry. I said it like we do locally. Sorry. John Beaufort, Uncle John's son, was made first Earl of Somerset. A threat to Richard's authority was still lingering. Goes on really dark. This was thought the House of Lancaster, which was represented by Uncle John and his son Henry Bolingbroke. This branch of the family held greater wealth than any other family in England, and they were of royal descent. So they could be candidates to succeed Richard, as he was still without an heir. Conflict broke out Sorry, I know I'm off camera, I'm like trying to see this. Conflict broke out in December of 1397 in the inner circles of court. Henry Bolingbroke and Mowbray got into a fight. He said some bullshit. Henry said that Mowbray said some bullshit. Henry said that Mowbray said or claimed that the two of them were in line for royal retribution. Mowbray denied it because something like this would have been treason. A parliamentary committee decided that the two boys should settle the bullshit by battle, but Richard said no and exiled them both. Henry was exiled for 10 years and Mowbray for life. I'm going to jump off and I'm going to do my lashes and probably my hair. I'll be back. Okay, I'm back. Hair is curled. We're ready to go. So the next year, Richard had summoned the Parliament of Shrewsbury. This Parliament declared all the acts of the merciless Parliament null and void. They announced that no restraint be put on the king legally. On February 3rd of 99, Uncle John died. Richard extended the term of Henry's exile and felt safe as Henry was in Paris. And so in May, Richard went back to Ireland on another expedition. Meanwhile, in France, Louis I, Duke of Orleans, gained control of the court of Charles VI, who was mentally unstable. The policies with the English crown didn't suit Louis's ambitions, and so he allowed Henry to return to England. Henry landed in Ravensbourne in Yorkshire at the end of June. There he met with Henry Percy, 1st Earl of Northumberland. Henry assured Percy that he only wanted to get his inheritance back. Percy believed him and didn't get in his way. Since Richard took most of his household and loyal members with him, Henry had no problem as he moved south. Now, Henry and Richard's uncle Edmund was keeper of the realm. Uncle Ed was left with no choice but to back Henry. Richard was delayed getting back to England from Ireland and didn't land in Wales until July 24th. He met with Henry Percy on August 12th for negotiations, and on the 19th, Richard surrendered to his cousin Henry at Flint Castle. He promised to abdicate if his life was spared. The two cousins went to Chester Castle, and Richard was held in the crypt of one of the towers. They made their way to London, and Richard was imprisoned in the Tower of London on September 1st. There's a whole thing here about the line of succession, and that is more of Henry's story, and when I get there, we'll discuss that. I'll insert my opinion on the whole thing here. Henry was a usurper. He was not next in line for the throne, and he pulled a massive strings to do this. I promise you, I will die on this hill. I don't like any of this. So anyways, we'll get back to Richard. According to the official record, Richard gave up his crown on September 30th during a ceremony attended by Lords and Commons at Westminster Hall. He gave it up willingly and ratified his deposition, citing as a reason of his own unworthiness as a monarch. There is another account saying that at this meeting, that this meeting went vastly different. It said that Richard went into a blind rage, ordered his release, called Henry a traitor, demanded to see his wife, and swore revenge. Then, throwing down his bonnet, and Henry refused to do anything with parliamentary approval. On October 1st, Richard was formally deposed, and October 13th, Henry was crowned. Henry agreed to let Richard live after abdicating the throne. This was probably because Henry's life was threatened by earls who had been demoted once Henry took the throne. It's believed that Richard starved to death and died on or around February 14th of 1400 at Pontefract Castle. His body was taken from Pontefract to St. Paul's Cathedral on February 17th to be displayed. He was buried in King's Langley Priory on March 6th. Rumors swirled that Richard hadn't actually died and was living in Scotland. Sound familiar-ish? To put an end to it, Henry V had his body taken from King's Langley and reinterred into Westminster Abbey on December 4th of 1413. This is where Richard had an elaborate tomb prepared for himself and where the remains of his wife Anne were already entombed, and that's where he still is. So with that all, let's get into fun facts. So just a few facts for Richard. He was tall. So for me, this is tall. I'm 5 even, so anything over 5'4" is tall to me. Richard was around 6 feet tall. It's said that he had a beautiful face, white, rounded, and feminine looking. His mental state has been a historical debate. It's argued that his mind was losing its balance, and another historian, Anthony Steele, concluded Richard had schizophrenia. This was challenged, and will we ever really know? Probably not. But I find it interesting so many had mental issues, like mental health issues. So that's it for Richard. Thank you so much for watching. If you have not done so yet, please make sure you give the video a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Everything I use is going to be listed down below. If you enjoy my content and you'd like to help support my journey, I guess, you can head on over to buymeacoffee.com/makeup and monarchies and donate to my coffee addiction. So we will be doing another one soon. I'm not quite sure what we're going to do next. I'll get there. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed. I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye.